we're going to talk about the future of Bitcoin security, and I'm going to focus a lot on the security budget and mining related stuff here. But just as a broad question, what do we mean when we say security for Bitcoin? Well, we mean a few things. Certainly, one we know we mean is that Bitcoin UTXOs, right, our coins can't be spent by anyone who doesn't have the right private keys, right? That would be very insecure. Only you can spend your coins, right? Only the holder of the private keys can spend those UTXOs. That's important. That's what makes Bitcoin unseizable. We also know that transactions have to be permanent and irreversible. If they weren't, then Bitcoin wouldn't be very secure. And we also think of security as making Bitcoin censorship resistant, so that this is sort of in some ways it's the reverse way of thinking of security. It's the inability for me to be stopped from using Bitcoin, right? These last three are sort of almost perhaps a little tangential to the concept of security, but they're certainly important. Bitcoin has to be available, right? It has to be functioning. And this, I don't spend a lot of time talking about these two, but they both certainly should be given more attention, I think, by the community. And maybe we'll try to put some more effort into this. But supply chain must be resilient, and I mean that in two ways. I'm going to say the same thing. I actually also mean the source code, Bitcoin source code supply chain also needs to be resilient, but also hardware and miner software, right? Firmware for mining machines. This stuff needs to be bug free and available in general. Not controlled, for example, the entire supply chain by a malicious actor would be one way of thinking of this. And then obviously we need to pay for some development, right? Bitcoin doesn't have a pre-mine. It doesn't have a foundation. There's no group of insiders that are funding its development, right? Bitcoin is developed by volunteers all over the world, some of whom are paid by companies. They work at big companies. Others are funded by grants from big companies, which is great. We need more of it. Others are funded, and there are some major excellent nonprofits. You've got On the Brink, Bitcoin Brink. I'm not pumping any podcasts here. You've got Chain Code Labs. You've got others that are nonprofits that support the development of Bitcoin. You got MIT's Digital Currency Initiative. That needs to continue also for Bitcoin to remain secure. So these are just three ways. There's many more, but how could Bitcoin become insecure? Well, the one we're going to spend most of the time talking about is that miners could stop mining, right? Or they could, or we don't have enough honest hash rate, right? We don't have enough self-interested rational hash rate. Rational, maybe I shouldn't say that, because there are some scenarios where it could be rational to try to attack Bitcoin. So we need enough honest hash rate mining, right? If there isn't, then Bitcoin could become very insecure, and I'll talk about that a little bit. I'm not going to talk about these other two much. A lot has been said about them. More probably needs to be said about the second one here. But some of Bitcoin's underlying cryptography could become insecure, theoretically. A lot of people have hypothesized that quantum computing could make ECDSA or now even possibly Schnorr signatures insecure. Right. I think those fears are very overblown. And in some cases, it's completely untrue, but it's something to think about. And, as quantum advances, we'll want to pay attention to that. And then, like I said, if no one's paying for development of the protocol, then bugs could be identified and not fixed in a timely manner. There's many other ways that Bitcoin could become insecure, but this is a mining focused talk. So I'm going to focus on mining, and we're going to talk a lot about the security budget and how to pay for a sufficient amount of mining and what that means for Bitcoin over time. So just let's step back, right? Miners are essential. They are in many ways the most important network infrastructure of the Bitcoin network. They're not the only network infrastructure, and they're not kings. They can't do whatever they want, but they are responsible for settling transactions, right? They build the blockchain. They stack blocks, right? They're block stackers. And that helps prevent and build sort of cryptographic assurance that the chain can't be rewritten easily. And they don't do it for fun, right? They're not hobbyists. This isn't 2009. Miners are industrialists. They perform this service for money. Many of them, and rightly so, are very long Bitcoin, right? So they're not ruthless fiat. They don't necessarily view this as a fiat generation scheme, but nonetheless, they do it for money, right? And they're compensated for doing it by generating new coins, what we call new issuance, or even inflation, we might call it, right? And that the fact that they get new issuance for completing these tasks is how Bitcoin's monetary policy is affected, right? And we talk about that obviously, and I'll show the fun chart. We know about the halvings, right? So they receive for every block that is mined, the miner receives newly minted Bitcoins. The amount that they receive, the fact that they can't receive more, the schedule with which they receive those amounts, that is Bitcoin's monetary policy. And Bitcoin doesn't function without miners. So let's just dig into us paying miners. So we pay miners. Like I said, we pay the miners for this service. We're all paying it, first of all, in the form of issuance, right? That's dilution to holders of Bitcoin, right? Inflation is dilution. We know this as Bitcoiners. We're obviously very critical of it. Most of us, when it comes to looking at fiat currency, inflation is dilution. We're paying them through issuance of new Bitcoin. All holders of Bitcoin are. They're also receiving transaction fees by transactors, right? Those who spend and send Bitcoin. Those two together, we call miner revenue. We can also call it the security spend. Today, I'll call it security spend since we're focused on the future of Bitcoin security. And we're looking at the USD value of the newly minted issuance and the transaction fees. And I'll talk about that USD value and why it's USD and not Bitcoin denominated value. But it's very possible that one day it is Bitcoin denominated value. That actually is a very important question and thing to find out. Whether we do start considering it Bitcoin denominated value or USD denominated value really depends how we end up paying for this security in the long run. And I'll talk about that. So the issuance is a subsidy, right? We call that a subsidy because it's created and provided to them. And as I think most people probably know on the call, that subsidy halves every 220,000 blocks. That's about every 4 years. Those are the halvings. I'll show that in just 1 second. One thing we know for certain, absent a major change to the protocol, when all the Bitcoins are mined, fees will remain as the only form of compensation for miners. All right, so this is the model. This isn't the actual supply and inflation. You can see the we choose to do annualized inflation because it makes the curve really pretty, the blue curve here, but rather than say like per block issuance. This is Bitcoin's monetary policy. I've only modeled it out to 2040 or so because then the inflation rate is 0.1%. It's practically nothing. But this inflation is what we're paying miners with, right? And you can see that it halves every 4 years. As an interesting aside, this is the actual data versus the model, right? So this is the model. This is the actual, and then with the model picking up from the present. A couple interesting things here. First of all, it holds very closely, right? Bitcoin is a very efficient and powerful system. You can see there was a quick burst of mining at one point at the beginning, and then a big lull in 2009 where the inflation rate dropped significantly because a bunch of there were like days without blocks mined at some points briefly. But the other thing you notice is if we look at the model, the halving that we just had, I don't know if you can see my mouse when I move it here, but this halving, the third halving, 1, 2, 3, was supposed to happen right around 2021. That was the model. That's if every block was exactly 10 minutes apart, right? But the reality is it happened much sooner than that, right? It happened 7 months earlier than that. And that's because Bitcoin's hash rate has typically gone up. It's because average block times have typically been faster than 10 minutes. And that's because people are bullish on Bitcoin. That's because miners are constantly coming on the network, right? We're almost always adjusting the difficulty upwards, right? So Bitcoin's actually undertaking its monetary policy a little bit faster than the model would show. And that's because of how bullish miners are coming onto the network and mining, right? Again, because the monetary policy is a function of the issuance, and the issuance is provided to miners for mining blocks, right? And so Bitcoin's block time being an average of 10 minutes is essential for maintaining Bitcoin's monetary policy, right? If it's faster than that, if we artificially change it, say to 5 minutes, Bitcoin's will be released into the network much faster than intended. So anyway, I thought this is interesting, these two models. So, but let's think about this. I call this our basic model. This is our mental model that we're operating with here. One, Bitcoin is designed to transition from hodlers paying for security through inflation and dilution to transactors paying for security through fees, right? If you own Bitcoin, if you own 5 Bitcoins in the first year in 2009 or 10, you own a significant portion of the network, right? But those 5 Bitcoins are a very tiny portion of the network. Come today, now they're very valuable. You're in USD terms, good for you. But right, that's dilution. We're actually paying, because such a large portion of the security spend is inflation. We're paying miners out of dilution today, and we are from the very beginning. And in fact, Bitcoin didn't have meaningful fees at all for several years until after it launched. So it literally was like 100% issuance paying for security. But we know, one of the things we know, the inflation schedule is known, right? This is why Bitcoin is such a powerful system. This is one of the reasons many people find such value in Bitcoin, is that we know that the inflation schedule will terminate to zero, right? That inflation it will end. That Bitcoin has a fixed supply is one of its most valuable propositions, most differentiating, probably its single sole most differentiating feature from all other cryptos and all other currencies ever created. So first of all, we want to support that. That's something I'll talk about a little bit. We want that to remain true, because this is sort of like our big go at creating as humans at creating a fixed supply currency, a cryptographically perfectly fixed supply currency. And by the way, like, the fact that it terminates in a fixed supply is what sort of raises this question that this whole talk is about, right? Because we could just do what other networks do, like Ethereum, and just have a permanent issuance schedule, right? Permanent inflation. It could be fixed or otherwise. And that can always be used to pay for some amount of mining. Because we know we don't have that, the other two variables that we have to pay attention to are the Bitcoin to USD exchange rate and the fees that are paid by transactors. We'll call it the total fees, right? So we know the inflation schedule, but we don't know the Bitcoin USD exchange rate, and we don't know the fees in the future. And so we hypothesize, and I would argue we know that to maintain the same security budget, let's say that we have today or at any point in time, right? Either or both the exchange rate and or the fees must rise, both in relative and absolute terms, to pay for hash rate. We're going to talk about that, but let's talk about paying for hash rate, right? How much are we paying? Well, this is, like I said, the security spend, also miner revenue. Those are the same thing here. They are comprised of the sum of the total issuance. This is a daily chart. I'll show you the annualized one in a minute. The total issuance and the total fees. So these are just in native terms. This is Bitcoins, right? So, let's say in the first halving era, we can see that, let's say an average of 7,500 Bitcoins were mined per day. I'm just looking at the chart. You see it varies because of variations in the amount of hash rate, right? That declines. You can see the little fuchsia, those little dots. I think they're fuchsia, pinkish purple. That is fees, right? Stacked on top, right? And you can see there are times in 2017 and early 2018 when there were significant fees. We know this. We were there, right? Many of us probably were watching, invested in working on Bitcoin in 2017 and 18. Remember, there was a big narrative. Oh my gosh, fees are so high. Well, they were high. And people paid a lot in fees then, right? And you can see in 2021, it's a bit of a defined fee band there, right? People paying fees this year. You say, obviously, my gosh, like the fee, like in native terms, the total spend has gone down clearly. And so how much of a percent of the total has been comprised by fees? So the orange here is the percentage of the security spend comprised of fees alone. And like I said, you see that big band of fuchsia sitting on top of the blue in 2017 and 18. Well, yeah, it was nearly 30% of funds collected by miners were fees, right? So that was a good amount of spend. And we see that in 2021, we were in the 10 to 20 range, 25% range a couple times. It's now quite low. And but the other thing to pay attention to is the fact that it's volatile, right? This is volatile because demand for block space has been volatile. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But despite that craziness, obviously miners have been making tons of money, more than ever before, right? And that's the green that I put here. Again, this is daily. So there have been some days where miners made over $80 million a day. Said another way, the network paid in security spend over $80 million, right? This is the sum in dollar amount of both the issuance and the fees. Well, how is that possible when issuance and fees have declined? Issuance has declined significantly over time. You can see it stepping down. Those are the halvings happening. Well, it's because the price of Bitcoin went up a lot, right? And it really went up a lot. Like last May, when the third halving happened, the price of Bitcoin was about $6,500. Well, the price basically 10x'd at its peak from there, even though the issuance per block declined from 12.5 Bitcoin to 6.25 Bitcoin. So even though the biggest component of security spend cut in half, well, the price, the value of those coins 10x'd, right? So, and even if you take 10K as the reference price, they 5x'd, right? So that's an important thing to remember. So one, we're paying for more mining than ever before in dollar terms, even as the issuance declines. And this is why I say that the two important variables here are the price of Bitcoin and the amount of fees that are paid. But I have an argument that I'm going to make that the fees are more important and that we want there to be more fees, but we'll talk about that. Let's look at this on annualized terms. So on the left, we have the security spend as a percentage of the market cap. On the right, we have the security spend as a percentage of the value that Bitcoin settles. And by the way, there's no real right answers here. I think it was Mr. Hoddle on Twitter pointed out, and you'll see this in my summary slide in just moments. No one actually knows how much we're supposed to be spending, right? And so we'll talk about that in a second. But again, just sticking with the data. On the left side, we calculate the spend as a percentage of market cap. And for this, by the way, we're just using the literal daily average market cap of Bitcoin, taking the market cap every single day for that year and averaging it. And that's in billions of dollars. This, annoyingly, and I'm sorry, but the security spend columns are in millions. The average market cap and the settled value are in billions. And obviously 2021 on both of these things is incomplete, right? So just to be clear, like, wow, particularly on settled value, average market cap, I hope will still go up for the year. I think it will for 2021, but settled value is going to rocket. We're probably going to see $10 trillion settled on Bitcoin in 2021, I would guess, which is just truly astonishing. But if we look just over time, I mean, we can see that obviously both decline, and by the way, none was spent on security. I should have made this chart on the right also start in 2010, start in 2009. Recall that I believe the first known price of Bitcoin is on July 18th, 2010. So there is no price for Bitcoin in 2009, which means there can be no market cap or settled value in dollar terms. So, but look, both are tiny. Now, we don't know if this is right or wrong or good or bad necessarily, but there have been arguments made in both directions. I'm really not going to venture to say how much we should be spending, but it's worth noting that, one argument that Lynn Alden made was that, well, wow, if we, rather than looking at it at the spend as a percentage of average market cap, we should maybe look at it as a percentage of settled value, because we're going to be asking transactors to be paying for this primarily once the issuance runs out. And is 0.16%, like that's kind of the fee, right? We're sort of thinking about like, what's the appropriate fee? It should be considered perhaps at a transaction basis, not on the value of the whole network. And by the way, the settled value dramatically exceeds the average market cap of Bitcoin. I mean, not quite 10x, but people move a lot of coins around. And so asking transactors to pay, which is what we're already asking to do. So the question kind of becomes maybe like, how much should they pay on a sort of annualized average basis? What is an appropriate fee? And it doesn't seem like it has to be that big, I guess is my other point, right? 0.1% maybe, but to sort of stay where we are today. But again, there's a lot of variables here. I just wanted to show this data This is how much we're paying on an annualized basis. All right, let's compare to Ethereum. So, and they're not apples and apples because ETH is GPU mined, but that's part of why I wanted to make this point. So if we look at the total security spend in terms of average market cap, they're spending a lot more than Bitcoin, right? The Ethereans are spending 4.5% of the average market cap in 2021, and 1.7% of the average market cap across all of 2020 on security. And meanwhile, Bitcoiners are spending 1.23% in 2021 and 2.4% last year. So a little more last year than ETH, but a lot less this year. And the same is true if we look at by settled value, right? So in 2021, Ethereans are paying 0.3% of the settled value, and Bitcoiners are paying 0.1%, 0.16%, right? So a little bit, basically half Bitcoiners are paying of the settled value, right? Now, this makes sense for a couple of reasons. One, we know fees on Ethereum are super, super high right now, and they have been at other times this year, higher than they've ever been in dollar terms on Bitcoin. And that's because of a lot of DeFi and NFT related activity, primarily on Ethereum. And we don't know if, I'm not saying they're overpaying. I'm just saying they're paying a lot. So of course it's a higher percentage of their total market cap and of their total settled value. But the other point that's really important to make here is that GPUs are widely available, right? They probably should be paying more, right? There's a giant pile of GPU hash power sitting off the network right now, right? That could theoretically come on the network to attack Ethereum and other GPU mineable proof of work coins, right? So think about all the computing power right now that is being devoted to animating, to rendering animations for Pixar movies and everything else, right? Or do machine learning and AI. There's a giant amount of extant potential hash rate sitting outside the Ethereum network, right? Whereas Bitcoin, because it's mined only by ASICs, right? There isn't a giant pile of SHA-256 hash rate sitting extant to the network. So it makes sense that a GPU mineable coin should probably spend more as a percentage of at least these two things, but maybe even more in absolute terms. And they are spending more in absolute terms. Just this year to date, right? Ethereum has spent 11.6 billion in security spend compared to Bitcoin's 10.1 billion, right? So they're spending more on security. Now, are they spending too much? Again, just like Bitcoin, we don't know. So let me come into this. How much, it raises the question, how much do we need to pay for hash rate? Well, the simplest answer is we don't actually know how much hash rate we need. We could have enough. We could have more than we need to even today. My colleague Kareem Helmi points out that although we don't know how much we need, the raw size does actually matter because it's easier to seize 500 mining machines than it is to seize 500,000, but it's possible we may already have enough. No one really knows, right? And it's worth noting the Bitcoin community typically opts for maximum security and decentralization, and that applies here to mining, right? So we want more and we want it to be more widely distributed. The real measure isn't the absolute hash rate, the actual value, amount of hash rate, to determining how secure a proof of work coin is. The real measure is what percentage of the total possible hash rate, the total available hash rate, is mining that coin, right? So with Bitcoin, we know that because Bitcoin uses ASICs to mine, a significant portion of the hash rate is mining Bitcoin, probably 99% of the available SHA-256 hash rate. This is why, by the way, BSV, as an example, the minority fork of Bitcoin, is so insecure. And by the way, it's been attacked multiple times successfully in a 51% attack. It's because from the BSV network's perspective, there is a giant pile of hash rate sitting off the network, right? It's mining Bitcoin, the real Bitcoin, BTC, right? And the same is true for GPU. As I mentioned, GPU mined coins are inherently less secure because they're mineable by generalized computational hardware. And so there's a giant pile of that sitting off that's not currently mining Ethereum or these other GPU mineable coins, right? That leaves a large amount of potential hash rate that could somehow be marshaled to attack the network. And we don't want a pile of Bitcoin miners to be offline or mining some other network, right? Because then they can come from without and disrupt the network within. Just as an aside here, this is one reason why researchers and Bitcoin miners have been focusing so much on the migration out of China from the Bitcoin mining ban in China. Incredibly amazing that the network itself wasn't disrupted, right? Because a reduction in hash rate leads to downward difficulty adjustments, and the network itself continues operating fine. But we want, and we pay close attention, the second we start hearing that hash rate might be getting bought up, that now extant hash rate, right, that came off the network could be being acquired or seized by one entity, a nation state, or one big party, that would be extremely troubling. Now, we haven't heard that, right? Instead, we know of a lot of miners in North America and around the world that are trying to acquire that hash rate. But that's something we want to be careful of, right? It's good. It's not just good for narrative terms that Bitcoin mining is leaving China. It is good for the narrative. It's actually good for the actuality, because that giant amount of hash rate that was sitting in one jurisdiction, right? A jurisdiction, by the way, that's as authoritarian and with significantly weaker property rights than a lot of Western countries, right? That's a risk, because that hash rate can be seized, right? And so we don't want that giant pile of miners to be offline, and we don't want it to be in the hands of one entity. One last point here, I think, that sort of flows from the same thought process. If we take away the fact that machines depreciate, they break, we just assume they don't. Basically, what we mean is that the total network hash rate needs to at least stay flat or grow, right? Because if it's declining, that means hash rate is coming off the network. And if those machines, again, we're assuming they're not breaking, right? If they're coming off the network and therefore sitting somewhere idle, right, they become much easier to seize, purchase, rent by an attacker. So declining hash rate means the machines are on the sidelines, and that is something we don't want. Because, to summarize, like I said, the real measure of security by hash rate isn't the total absolute amount of hash. We don't know how much we actually need. What we know for certain is that we don't want a giant pile of hash rate sitting offline, able to come on the network at will or be rented or seized by an attacker. But let me talk about and give an example of an attack that could happen. Not everyone probably really knows what a 51% attack is. And then I'll briefly talk about two other types of attacks as well. But let's do a diagram of a 51% attack. And I think my friend Bob is on video right now. I can't see, but is on the call. And he may recall this from a paper that I wrote a couple of years ago. I've repurposed this graphic. That was called "May the Fork Be With You." This is the 51% attack. So let's give an example here. So what is a 51% attack? So the primary reason you might 51% attack a network, and we see this all the time on weaker networks, again, on BSV, on Vertcoin many times, on a bunch of other small proof of work networks, we've seen it. Someone claims to have done it once on Bitcoin almost a decade ago, but no one really knows. But the main goal typically of a 51% is to double spend some coins. And I want to talk about what that means, but that really means spending coins and then having them not be spent, but having got the goods or services in return for having spent those, right? And then unspending them. So here we have in blue, the blockchain, right? And then in purple, we've got a malicious miner. The truthful miners are adding blocks to the public chain. When they find a new block, they broadcast them to the network. This is the normal behavior, right? But at some point, a malicious miner who has offline hash rate, right? This is why we want the majority of the available hash rate on Bitcoin. Because if a malicious miner has a lot of offline hash rate, they can perform this attack. So they've got offline hash rate and they're performing work. They're doing proof of work. They're adding blocks to their secret chain, but they're not broadcasting it, right? So as far as the network goes, these fine folks, these fine teal folks up there and blue folks, they just go about their lives mining their chain, right? They don't know anything about this malicious miner because he's not broadcasting his blocks. Meanwhile, the malicious miner spends 50 Bitcoin on the normal chain, the public chain. Let's say he buys a house or something. The guy, let's use the house analogy, even though it's kind of dumb. A car might be better because you can drive it off, but let's pretend, actually, we'll use a car. He buys a very, very, very expensive car. Lord, like the most expensive car. Even better, he buys a spaceship. All right. The malicious miner buys a spaceship for 50 Bitcoin. He goes and he's got his wallet and he sends the Bitcoin to Mr. Spaceship Salesman. They're standing on the launch pad. The spaceship salesman says, great, I see one confirmation, right? Because in block 22, you sent me this Bitcoin. That was one confirmation. And then block 23 was stacked on top of it. That's two confirmations. He's like, you know what? I feel good about that. I'm going to let you go, right? By the way, I just did two for keep the chart. Let's say he waits three. That's fine too. Anyway, he hands over the keys to the spaceship, right? The malicious miner says, great, hops in the spaceship, flies away. So now everyone's happy, right? Because the seller has this 50 Bitcoin, the malicious miner has a spaceship, right? Everybody seems happy. So the malicious miner has spent these coins on the truthful chain, but meanwhile, on their private version of this blockchain, they don't spend the coins, right? This is just one way. You could do it the reverse. You could spend coins to one person, but then to another person, right? But whatever you do, you don't spend the coins in that same way, right? So in this case, he doesn't spend them. That's why it's -0 BTC, right? So he spent them on the public chain to buy the spaceship, and he's now flown away with the spaceship. And on his chain, he doesn't spend them, right? He still has that 50 Bitcoin on his chain. So now the race is on, right? He's now mined block 23. Both chains are racing, although again, unbeknownst to the public chain, he is now racing to build a longer chain than the public chain. And he has more hash power. If he has 51% of the hash power, I did 4 rigs and versus 2, but point is if the malicious miner has more hash power than the rest of the public network, then eventually that miner will create a chain that is longer and has more established and accrued proof of work, right? The truthful miners are adding blocks to the public chain, but they're adding them at a slower pace than the malicious miner because the malicious miner has more hash rate than them, right? So even if it's 50, just more than the 50%, eventually they'll outpace the rest of the chain, right? And it's at that point, as soon as they do, bam, block 24 mined first. I would do it as soon as they do. Theoretically, they could just keep waiting and they could do it whenever they want. But at some point, when their private version of the chain is longer and has more accrued proof of work, they then broadcast the whole chain to the whole public network, right? And all the nodes and wallets are going to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. Nakamoto consensus says that we should now follow this chain. Actually, oops, we should have been following this chain the whole time, is one way they might think, right? Because they're going to follow the chain with the most proof of work, the longest chain, right? And on that chain, the miner hasn't spent that 50 Bitcoin, yet he's already flying around, flying out to Mars on the spaceship, right? So he's got the goods and services. And what happens is when all the nodes and miners switch to look at his chain and recognize his chain as the longest chain, all the wallet balances and transaction histories will now be updated according to the truth of this chain, right? Of his chain, right? And then basically those previously mined blocks are invalidated, right? The old public chain is abandoned because it's shorter, right? In fact, not only do nodes and everyone follow the longest chain, but the other miners follow it, right? So there they are. Those are my teal miners. They've moved down there to hang out with Mr. Malicious Purple Man, right? And Malicious Miner still has his 50 Bitcoin, but he also has the spaceship, right? So he's stolen. That is the double spend attack. It's most commonly enacted against exchanges, right? Not for spaceships, right? You send your 50 Bitcoin into the exchange. Let's say you buy something with it, like dollars or another coin. You withdraw the coin or the dollars, and then the reorg happens. And now it's like you never made the initial deposit to the exchange, yet you've absconded with the exchanged coins, right? So this is the 51% double spend attack, right? And you can do other types of attacks. I'll talk about a couple more, but this is the most common reason to try to attack Bitcoin. It's for money, right? It's for money. But there's some really important considerations. By the way, this is also, I said it once, but this is also known as a blockchain reorganization, right? Now, reorgs can happen at very shallow for innocuous reasons, but we're just going to talk about this attack. So some notes on this, though, that are really important. First, if you're doing this attack to double spend coins, you don't actually want to destroy Bitcoin, right? You need the coins to hold value because you're trying to spend them, and you're also trying to not spend them, right? So there's some interesting considerations that come in here, right? They actually want the coins they double spend to remain valuable. So they don't want to destroy the chain, right? So that means a couple things. For one, the reorg should be fewer than 100 blocks. And I want to credit Hasu he may not be the first person who said this, Hasu and Presswitch and Brennan Curtis in their paper, but it was the first place a while ago that I thought of this. Well, they wrote it, but the first that I saw it was The idea that the attacker should try to keep the reorg smaller than 100 blocks. So in our example, we only have a few blocks, right? Like, just again, I'm not like, it's a PowerPoint presentation. But you want to keep it less than 100 blocks because newly minted Bitcoins are not spendable until after 100 blocks have passed. If I mine a block, I have to wait 100 blocks before I can spend that Coinbase issuance. And if our reorg is longer than 100 blocks, then we're going to start to undo the creation of new coins. In addition to just, all we really cared about in this attack, to be honest, right, is undoing our 50 Bitcoin spend, right? That technically, that's all we care about. We might even, if we're being very precise, make sure in our version of the blockchain to specifically replay every single other transaction that has occurred, right? Except for where we deposited that 50 Bitcoin for that spaceship, right? That's the only transaction technically we need to, and may even want to, invalidate to do this attack. And the reason is because, again, we don't want to damage the entire blockchain. We don't want to undo everything, because people will freak out, right? Bitcoin, they'll be like, oh my God. and this becomes especially true if we reorg Bitcoin more than 100 blocks, because if we do, then entire coins that have been created and their descendants and other transactions will be invalidated. That will be very disruptive. Another point to make here is that this is for a double spend. And to do this double spend, you really do have to mine in secret, because otherwise everyone will see that you're double spending, right? But you could just take your 51% and refuse to build on a minority chain, right? You could do a sabotage. You basically just cause tons of disruption. Everybody would be like, what the hell's going on, right? Like the nodes would constantly be like jumping between yours and the rest of the network. And so that's more of a sabotage attack. To do the double spend, you basically do have to mine in secret so that you surprise everyone with this unspent coin. So how do we mitigate this in general? One, it's, just to be clear, it's very, very expensive to do this attack. It's expensive both in upfront cost and in ongoing cost. And that's because getting 51% of Bitcoin's hash rate is extremely expensive. Now, there are types of attacks I'm not going to really talk about because due to time constraints, but there are types of attacks and other sabotage attacks that you can do with less than 51% of the hash rate, right? Mostly disruptive attacks, not really, certainly not really double spending, most likely. But to get 51% of Bitcoin's hash rate is ludicrously expensive. All my mining friends know this. Amanda and Rachel, they know this, right? It's expensive to mine Bitcoin. It's expensive. The machines are expensive. The electricity is expensive. Finding a place to put the machines is expensive, and it takes time, right? So that is really costly in general. We want it to remain costly, just to be clear. A major defense is the wide distribution of hash rate to different people, to different entities, and in different jurisdictions, right? This is one reason why it was great. We want to see hash rate leave China, at least a lot of it, not necessarily all of it. We don't really care, but we certainly don't want, and not just because it's a bad narrative, but because it is actually bad, a majority of hash rate to be located in China. Now, we don't know if it actually was, right? I don't want to give all these caveats, right? The pools of Chinese, it doesn't necessarily mean the miners are there. But it's not just because of the narrative that China controls Bitcoin. We know miners don't control Bitcoin, but it really is true that we don't want a giant pile of machines in one jurisdiction, particularly one as authoritarian as China, right? I feel, to me, they're more likely to be seized in a place like China than in a Western country where property rights are sort of more established and legal systems are more robust. So we don't want it concentrated in one location. Another point that I really like from Hasu and Prestwich and Curtis's paper is that miners are highly committed to defending the chain due to their significant costs. Now, it's not rocket science, but they call this miner commitment, and they're totally right. It costs a lot to get a bunch of machines. In fact, many miners, they're basically writing off the first year or more in some cases, right? It takes to actually make back their initial investment. So they don't want to destroy the chain, or at least not right away, right? They don't want to come right on the network and destroy the chain. Another thing is that as soon as the new chain is broadcast, everyone will see that this has happened, right? So it's not like we won't know until some future date when the damage is irreversible. Like, we will know right away when a 51% attack is actually enacted. Something like Bitcoin, we don't always know right away with some, very minor coin because, frankly, nobody cares about those coins and they're not really watching them as diligently. But we're watching Bitcoin closely, many people, let alone an amazing service I want to shout out, Fork Monitor. I think it's .info, forkmonitor.info, that BitMEX research runs, right? And literally monitors this in real time. So we'll know. And why is that important? Well, one, if it's disruptive enough, if anything, whether it's a sabotaged attack, whether it's a 51% attack, it's worth noting, although disruptive, users can suspend Nakamoto consensus and we can act outside the protocol to undo it, right? Now, this has only been done, I think, once in Bitcoin's history when there was a big inflation bug very early on in the software's life, not really due to a mining attack, but a sort of a hard fork state intervention. But we could, right? If we said, whoa, China, we just realized that China seized all these miners and now they're perpetually attacking the network. Users could say, you know what? We're going to change the hashing algorithm that will brick all these ASICs, right? Make their attack totally useless. And we'll roll it back. Well, if we found the double spent transaction, we're going to roll it back, right? Users, and when I say users, I mean the whole community. If it was so urgent to do so, could do that, right? They could always do that. It'd be hard, it'd be disruptive, but if the damage was significant enough, I bet Bitcoiners would make it take a drastic action. And I don't want to, that's an extremely positive thing. Bitcoiners should be willing to do that if it comes to that, right? At some incredible level. And again, I'm not saying regularly, I never want to do this if we don't have to, but we want to say we'll do this, and we want to be okay with doing it. And this is a nuclear option that users have in the face of an attack, particularly a state level attack. You know, a state's not going to spend the billions of dollars it requires to set up 51% of the hash rate if they know that a bunch of nerds on the internet can just push out new code to totally brick their investment immediately, right? That's a great defense. It would be disruptive. It hasn't happened really. And frankly, Bitcoin hasn't really been successfully attacked either. But it's something to remember and this helps mitigate a 51% attack. All right, very quickly, other types of attacks. And I know we're almost out of time here. So a sabotage attack, right? This is a broad category of attacks, but essentially we're not trying to make money from the attack. We just want to disrupt Bitcoin. Therefore, the cost to us and the punishments that will stop us from doing this are much lower. In some cases, non-existent. Well, if we had a ton of hash rate, we could mine empty blocks. This attack is kind of dumb because it costs a lot of money and you get very little money for doing it. But you could just mine empty blocks, right? It's basically like DDoSing the network. You could say, gosh, no transactions will get into my blocks. Unless you have 100% of the hash rate, blocks will still get mined that have transactions, so it doesn't actually like stop Bitcoin. It just bogs us down, makes us annoyed, right? And eventually we might try to do something. We could fork you off the network with a new algo or something like that. We could just say we're not accepting any transactions that don't have X fee, right? So it's an extortion. Again, it doesn't stop Bitcoin, but it could be so high as to make Bitcoin really unappealing and then crash the price of Bitcoin. Most of these sabotage attacks are essentially the ideas that you could kill Bitcoin by disrupting the network so much that confidence in the system declined enough that price collapsed. And then another type of attack, we could call it, I do view this as an attack, absolutely. Some people view this as compliance, I do not, is you could censor transactions, right? And the more hash rate you have, the more effective your censorship will be. And this doesn't have to be one entity. You could get a coalition of entities that could agree to censor either classes of transactions, everything from this country or from this person or sent to this location or of this whatever, right? Or it could be one giant entity that just says, you know, I'm going to mine Bitcoin, but I'm never going to mine these types of transactions. All right, let's summarize some of this. I want to put a few pins in some points and some T's need to get crossed and some I's dotted. So a big takeaway here, we don't actually know how much hash rate we actually need for Bitcoin to be considered secure. We just know that we need the majority of the hash rate that could be mining Bitcoin to be mining Bitcoin. Today, it certainly is. An enormous amount of the available SHA-256 hash rate is mining Bitcoin. Probably like 99.2% of the existing ASICs are mining Bitcoin, BTC Bitcoin, you know, the real Bitcoin, actual Bitcoin. Another thing we know is that as the subsidy declines, right, the issuance rate of Bitcoin declines, right, as we approach that terminal fixed supply of Bitcoin, which I contend is a key characteristic of Bitcoin, perhaps the characteristic, The single most important characteristic to me personally is that Bitcoin's monetary policy is credibly unchanging and that it terminates in a fixed supply. That's what distinguishes it from literally everything. We could even say everything in the universe, right? But we know, therefore, because we know that that's going to happen, as the subsidy declines, if we wanted to pay for the same amount of hash rate we're paying for today, let's say that's enough. Again, we don't know how much is enough. Then we know that fees have to go up or price has to go up. Something has to go up to make up that difference in declining Bitcoin issuance, right? In dollar terms, to pay these miners. We actually, fees can't, good, this point, I stick to my own, sorry. Expound, let me stick to my ordering here. Fees can only rise if there's an increased and sustained demand for block space, right? If blocks are empty, no one's going to pay fees, right? And this is an important point because when I said we wanted Bitcoin transitions naturally from hodlers paying for security through dilution, inflation, to transactors paying for security through fees. If there aren't enough transactions happening, then there aren't enough fees, right? Blocks aren't full. You wouldn't pay a high fee, right? So we need transactional activity on the base layer to pay some fees. And if we don't pay enough for mining, another thing we know, then miners won't make enough money. So some miners will turn off their machines, right? And that's fine for the network in general. Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment, a beautiful, incredible innovation, will adjust down. Those who remain mining will keep mining blocks and transactions will continue settling, but we'll be amassing a pile of hash rate that is sitting outside the network, waiting for an attacker. Easier, becomes available for rent, for purchase, for seizure by a malicious entity, right? That we don't want. So we'd like to pay for mining. Let's put it that way. A couple other takeaways here. One, I say that price or fees have to rise, or both. Technically, we could have zero fees when Bitcoin's at the next halving. Bitcoin issuance will drop from 6.25 to 3.125. Is that right? Yep. Per block, BTC. If the price of Bitcoin doubles from where it is today, miners will make the same amount of money, right? Have the issuance, double the value. Seems fine, right? In reality, we actually want fees. We want it to be in fees because we want the even if price didn't rise, we actually want miners to be making a lot in native terms. We want miners to be getting BTC. That helps them stay long Bitcoin, right? We don't want them to be, and also through a sabotage attack, for example, it's much easier to negatively impact the sentiment of the community and therefore the price of Bitcoin. And it would make it much more volatile as a source of income for miners if they solely, if the sort of rise in compensation or maintenance of their compensation was solely based on a rise in price. So we would like to see in native terms, their compensation rise. We haven't seen that over the time, but perhaps we will if fees go up. And here's another interesting point. High fees are a defense mechanism for high value transactions, because if transactions are paying a lot in fees, then there's much less incentive for miners to reorg out those transactions or try to attack and do shallow reorgs, because let me put it this way: to do a reorg in general might entail losing those fees, right? And so if we have high fees, right, it's a nice defense against a shallower reorg in general, because if the reorg fails, you've now given up these fees, right? Because in a reorg, you also still get that native issuance, just to be clear, right? You still get your mining blocks, you still get like whatever the issuance is, but you won't get the fees if you don't include those transactions. And then I made this point already. And then yes, jurisdictional distribution is very good defense against the centralization of hash rate. We want to see hash rate spread all around the world, right? And we are seeing it get more and more distributed, which is great. All right, and I think this is my last slide, so I think I'm right on time here. Amanda, you go. Amanda, I hope you're in the car right now. Amanda's got to get to an important appointment. What is the future? What does a high fee future mean for Bitcoin? Okay, so if what we're saying is that fees need to go up, should go up, we think they will go up. We think they will go up. I think they'll go up. I also think they should go up. I'd like to see them go up. What does that mean, though, right? Well, we know that will price out many types of uses from the base layer blockchain, right? The old adage, oh, you can't buy a coffee with Bitcoin. Well, by the way, folks, right now you can definitely buy coffee with Bitcoin. Fees are super low. But we don't want you to be able to buy coffee with Bitcoin. If you can, in the future, it means miners won't be making a lot of money, right? Just like this whole presentation has discussed. So we know that if there are high fees, a lot of use cases like buying coffee will be priced out, right? And so lower value transactions necessarily must occur on a higher layer, right? Like Lightning Network, which I'll talk about a little bit. Moving funds on chain then might be more like an interbank settlement, right? Or moving your family's stash of gold. You know, if you're Smaug from The Hobbit, the dragon who sits on a pile of gold and casts spells to defend it, it'd be like, oh, you got to move it to a new cave, right? That's like what moving Bitcoin on chain might be. Now, it might not be as ludicrous as that. It could just be moving collateral around, right? Or it could be, you know, look, you've been in Bitcoin for, you know, it's the year is 2050. You've been in Bitcoin since 2021. You've got a nice stack of Bitcoin by then. And, you know, you only really move it on chain if you have to like transfer it to your heirs, right? So it could be that type of movement. The idea, the prediction I'm making is that institutions and what I'm going to call aggregation services, whether they're custodial or non-custodial, will be the primary on-chain transactors because average folks, small amounts, Bitcoin fees will be too high. So instead, they'll transact either through intermediaries, which are custodial. Those could be exchanges or banks. It could be like Cash App, right? Or ideally, non-custodial tools. And that could include something like wacky, like cross-input signature aggregation, some way for us to pool together our transactions. And we all pay a small fee, but to make one transaction, a bunch of us come together to collaboratively make one transaction. I think this is going to be really awesome when we get this, and I hope we will. So me and 10 other people collaborate to create one transaction. We all pay, for us, a smaller fee, but in aggregate, we pay a fee large enough to move the funds on chain, right? And we can do this in a non-custodial way, or the one we're all familiar with, the Lightning Network, right? Something where the on-chain coin doesn't move very often. Instead, it sits inert, locked in an escrow, but in the meantime, we move the coins very quickly back and forth on these other layers, right? I argue that if that's the world we get to, that's still great. And it's, again, it goes back, I've said this multiple times during this talk, because the defining characteristic for me is Bitcoin's monetary policy. That is what makes Bitcoin differentiated from every other asset on Earth. And that is still maintained and secured in this future that I described, right? We can transact on other layers, we can do other things, but even in this world, Bitcoin's monetary policy remains intact. And that, you know, Chancellor's on the brink of second bailout for banks. In my view, that's the whole ball game with Bitcoin. And I know, obviously, forked communities like Bitcoin Cash, they disagree with that. But it's supposed to be fast, quick cash. Well, it is going to be that, just not at the base layer. So, look, I hope this is a good survey here. Oh, some stuff I didn't discuss, just really quick. We didn't discuss what happens with quantum computing and ECDSA and signature algorithms and stuff. We didn't discuss other security-related things that aren't sort of, we really spent this time talking about Bitcoin's security budget and paying for mining and why that's important and types of attacks that can happen with mining. I'm not going to read all these. Some resources I mentioned a couple of times. Hasu, James Presswich, and Brendan Curtis had a good paper raising some interesting points about this in 2019. You can just Google Hasu Bitcoin security and you'll find that, or you can click this link. I don't know if this will be available. Lynn Alden wrote a good piece on this that has a little bit of a different view, but she offers some good stuff here. And Dan Held has a piece that's been widely read also on this that I recommend. And that is all. I'm going to stop. I will stop sharing, but I will remind all viewers tomorrow, I think we're going to have a Q&A session on Twitter Spaces. Follow Amanda and Galaxy and me or something, and Rachel, and I'm sure we'll tweet about that. That is all. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Also check out mempool.space.